Welcome to our Smelling the TV and Licking the Dog Sensory Hacks for Parents webinar tonight. I am really excited that you are able to join me, and I really look forward to sharing some information with you that can help you and your children to live your best lives and to enjoy each other and the time that you have together. I want to introduce myself. I'm Allison Douglas. I am the Training and Education Coordinator for Harmony Family Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. My professional background is as a Montessori certified early childhood educator. And so I worked as a Montessori teacher for many years. And more recently, I have become certified in the neurosequential model of therapeutics and have studied child development, neural development with Dr. Bruce Perry through my agency, Harmony. But more importantly, really than any of my academic or job roles is that I have parented kids with sensory challenges. I am a former foster parent and have adopted 4 children through foster care, and I have lived with and loved and parented many kids that really struggled with sensory issues and the behavioral challenges that come along with that. And so a lot of the things that I share with you tonight come from my own experiences. There are tons of pictures of my own children engaging in sensory play and using sensory materials. And so I really hope that that experience is helpful for you and your family. I want you to know that I'm certainly not a physician, and so the presentation tonight is educational in nature. I won't be giving any kind of medical advice or information regarding diagnosis. If you feel that your child needs to be evaluated by a medical professional, I think that's really an important route to follow, and find someone that can be of assistance to you in the medical community. But tonight we'll be focusing on supporting the sensory needs of our kids through home-based play. And so a lot of the toys and the materials that we'll talk about may not be appropriate for your child's age or developmental level. So just assess that before you invite your child to play with those kinds of materials. And as always, use good judgment when your children are playing with sensory tools. Know where they are, what they're doing, and just make sure that we're supervising our kids at all times with these materials. So tonight, the things that we are going to cover are first really just digging in a little to the concept of what is sensory integration. And we're going to talk then about how sensory challenges or dysfunctions can impact our children's behavior. And then we're going to get to the really fun part, which is thinking about how we can meet the sensory needs of our kids through play and through activity. And so we are going to look at 3 hacks, tricks and tips for transition, how to create a sensory bug out bag, and then home-based sensory play using our $25 sensory essential kit. And so you can have a sensory sensitive and a rich sensory environment in your home without spending a lot of money. And so I hope that our $25 essentials will be a great basis for that with your family. So let's dig in a little bit to what is sensory integration. So sensory integration is our body's ability to receive and process stimuli from the external world and then to respond appropriately to that. So it's how our nervous system gets information from our senses and then creates appropriate motor and behavioral responses. And one of just the most simple ways to think about sensory integration and and behavioral response is to think about touching that hot cast iron skillet. So when you reach out and touch that skillet, forgetting to put a towel around it, your brain and body interprets this input from the external world through the tactile sense, and immediately we drop that pan. We're very likely to make some sort of sound, to make a noise, and our body just reacts, right? So that is exactly what sensory integration looks like. It's how our brain and body reacts, turning the external world into these appropriate motor and behavioral responses. And sensory processing is just foundational for a child's ability to function and thrive in the world. Because if a child has sensory dysfunction, if their brain and body are having trouble receiving or interpreting the messages from the outside world, then they turn it into inappropriate motor and behavioral responses. And that's why some of our kids are licking the TV, right? They're smelling the dog. Because for these kids, the messages that their body is receiving are getting interpreted in ways that don't allow them to respond appropriately. And so the name of this um, seminar absolutely comes from an experience with one of my own children.
So sensory processing is just absolutely foundational for a child's ability to function and thrive in the world. And so that's why so many of the children that we may be parenting are struggling, and they're licking the TV, right, and smelling the dog, is because their bodies were not able to process that sensory input appropriately. And there are many underlying reasons and co-occurring issues for many of the children that we parent. So when we think about why a child's sensory system may not be functioning in an optimal way, there are 5 typical reasons. The first is genetic factors, and this is just things like a child with autism spectrum disorder, just a factor that doesn't come from any external source, but it is more of a genetic factor. It's genetic in nature. Premature birth can be an underlying cause of sensory dysfunction. Head or brain trauma can cause that sensory dysfunction. For many of us who are foster parents or adoptive parents, our children may be struggling with sensory challenges because of abuse and neglect early in their life, or even prenatal substance exposure, so drugs or alcohol used prenatally. All of these can be factors in the sensory challenges that our children face. But regardless of why a child is struggling with sensory issues, we want to understand the senses better and then begin to put some really specific interventions into their lives. So let's unpack the senses a little more. So most of us remember the 5 senses from elementary school, right? The visual sense, what we see. Oral is what we taste, right? Olfactory is another word for what we smell. So smell is one of our senses. Auditory is what we hear. Tactile, or what we feel. Vestibular may be a new sense for some of the parents out there. And vestibular means having to do with the balance and coordination in the body. And so vestibular sense is really important in self-regulation and in a lot of mind and body functions like focus and attention. And so children who have challenges in the vestibular areas may need to jump a lot or bounce a lot. They like to swing. And so we're going to talk about ways to help children with all kinds of behavioral challenges by using vestibular input. Proprioceptive is another one of our senses. And the proprioceptive sense tells us where we are in space, right? Where are our limbs? How much force do we need to apply to get everyday tasks done like writing or standing next to a stranger, yet not putting our body against them, right? So where we are in space. And again, this is a sense that a lot of children really struggle with and need a lot of assistance in getting appropriate proprioceptive input. And the final sense that we're going to just talk briefly about this evening is interoceptive. And this means the sense of what is going on inside of the child's body and their body awareness. And so interoception has a lot to do with our awareness of things like our own hunger or thirst, or when we need to go to the restroom. You know, when do we know when we feel warm or cool? Do we know that when we feel pain in our bodies, or do we not feel it until it's incredibly intense? And so interoception is that final sense that we're going to talk about. And a lot of children, again, struggle with interoception. So you may have a child who doesn't appear hungry all day, and then right before dinner says, I need a snack. And you're going to tell them, can you wait 5 minutes? We're about to have dinner. And that kid goes from 0 to 60. Well, a child whose interoception is not incredibly healthy, is not fully functional, they may really not have noticed until they are incredibly hungry that their body needs to be fed. And so interoception is one of those senses that we don't often talk about or think about, but plays a really, really big role in behavior in many, many children. So what happens to us when our senses are appropriately functioning is that we go through our day with little or no thought about our body, right? We don't think about where our arms or legs are in space. We may not think about how we feel inside of our bodies if everything is working well. But when children who have dysfunctional sensory systems begin to notice this, we start seeing some real signs that look like this, right? The kid goes in the mall where it's loud and warm and there's lots going on, and they have a meltdown. We put on that new pair of Nike shorts that they wanted so badly, and they absolutely cannot wear them because that tag feels like a cactus against their skin. Right? We go to Target and we say, look with your eyes, not with your hands, and they touch everything, including the lady ahead of you in line, right? Or the toilet flushes, and you would think that this kiddo just heard the most obnoxious sound in the world because of their reaction. So when our senses are appropriately integrated, we walk through the day really being able to suss out what sounds are important and what are not. That this feeling on my skin, it's just a tag. It's not a big deal, right? We may see a beautiful fabric and think that looks lovely and not feel a deep desire to just touch that or rub it on our faces, right? We know that in a bathroom, we're going to hear a toilet flush. But for children who have sensory integration challenges, it is just incredibly hard for them to just cope with this constant amount of sensory input. So let's look at a couple different types of sensory dysfunction. So when we think about sensory dysfunction, we notice a group of children who appear to really be bothered by stimulation that feels really normal to other people. So those are the kids that have a really hard time with the seam on a sock, right? That feels typical to me. It doesn't really bother me. It feels pretty normal. But to a child who is sensory hyper aroused or over aroused, this is really bothersome. So things that feel normal to most folks are really, really overwhelming to children who are sensory hyper aroused. And some things that we may also notice in this group of children are that they typically have a bit of an increased heart rate. So they're often just hyper aroused in general, a little, over aroused. Often these children are very emotionally reactive. They can be full of energy, and we see a lot of muscle tension, and that goes again with that increased heart rate, with just that sort of fight or flight response, right? That they're just always a little over aroused. Some of the behaviors that you might notice in sensory hyperaroused children are that they just can't tolerate things like bright lights or loud noises, or even noises that we may not think of as loud, but feel really loud to the child. I remember a time that one of my children who had a lot of sensory challenges covered his ears and began just squalling during church, just making these really loud sounds. And he was much too old to be doing this type of behavior if you looked at it chronologically, right? He was an older child. And so the two of us kind of walked out the back door, and I said, "Dude, what's wrong?" And he said, "I like the singing, but it feels like needles in my ears." And so for this child, something that I found really beautiful and comforting and lovely to him felt like needles in his ears. And so, boy, did that explain the covering your ears and making loud sounds. So kids who are hyper aroused in sensory realm are often unable to tolerate things that we may even find wonderful and comforting. For some of these children, their clothing just doesn't feel right. It feels tight, it feels itchy, it's irritating. These may be the kids who really have a hard time wearing dress clothes. They don't like stiff fabrics. Wearing jeans is really hard. Just having that hard waistband and button can be really hard for them. Hyperaroused kiddos tend to melt down when they get overwhelmed. And they also can be easily distracted by things that don't really seem important to other people. It can be things like background noises, but it can also be visual things in a room. So I know so many kindergarten and preschool classrooms have a lot of artwork on the walls, things dangling from the ceiling. They're really covered from floor to ceiling with bright colors and moving things. And for most children, that's not a problem, but for children with sensory hyperarousal, that's really distracting and can be really problematic for them. So besides our children with hyper-aroused sensory systems, we may also have children with hypo or under-aroused sensory systems. And these children often crave more intensity and more input than other children. Sometimes these kids also appear low energy, just withdrawn. They have kind of a flat affect. They appear a bit disconnected, specifically in large groups. Sometimes they're considered lazy just because of this lower energy. And often these are kids that seem to space out. They stare at the wall. They have a hard time staying engaged. And so for those children, they need more intensity than a typical child would need. And for them, some of the behaviors that they may be dealing with are having trouble understanding where they are in space. They bump into people. They seemingly throw their bodies into objects or walls. I often observe in elementary schools, and I see children who cannot walk in a line, and it's just all the way down the hall, they're bumping their shoulder into the wall, right? So these are children that crave that sensory input. They are pushing themselves into other people or objects. They have trouble sensing how much force they need to use an object. So maybe this is a child that bears down so hard with their pencil that you can see their hand shaking. So many children with sensory under-arousal have a lot of trouble with handwriting because they tire very, very quickly. They get really fatigued because they hold the pencil so tightly, their hands and arms actually hurt. And so these children have trouble gauging the intensity. How hard do I need to hold this pencil? How hard do I need to hold the juice box? These are kids that when they're unpacking their lunchbox in the cafeteria, they often squeeze the juice box too hard, pull the bag open, and all of their chips go flying out. They have trouble gauging how much intensity they need to get things done. These are also kids who like to touch. They like to feel different textures. Sometimes they like to smell everything, or they're even easily overwhelmed by different textures and scents everywhere. And even when things are not socially acceptable, they cannot stop themselves from exploring the world around them in these sometimes pretty unacceptable ways. The title of this workshop actually comes from one of my own children. Again, I'm going to tell a story about this little friend who, when he was about 4 years old, we went to see Thomas the Train, and it was an actual train on the train tracks, and it's coming down the tracks, and he runs to the train, and the minute it stops, he just stuck his tongue out and walked down the length of the train car licking Thomas the Train. He just needed to explore that awesome, cool train with his body, even though obviously licking the train is quite socially unacceptable. So these are kids that just need to explore the world, even when it is not safe or prudent. Also, these are children that fall into the category of hyperactive behaviors, inattentive behaviors. They're often fidgety and can't sit still. They just need to be moving their bodies. So when we think about kids who are having sensory challenges, and my guess is if you've joined me tonight, you are thinking of a kid right now who may be hyper-aroused in the sensory realm, who may be hypo-aroused, who have some of these challenging behaviors that arise from their sensory needs. Then what do we do as parents, as folks that work in the child welfare system or educators? What do we do to help our kids cope? Well, the first thing that we can do, I mentioned at the very, very beginning of our hour, the first thing that we can do is make sure that we have considered professional evaluation and intervention. OTs and physical therapists can help children a great deal in overcoming some sensory challenges and learning how to cope with others. And so professional intervention should always be on our list. After we've gone down that route, or if you're currently doing those kind of professional interventions, then we just need to meet our kids' sensory needs in a really proactive way, hopefully throughout the child's day. That is the most helpful, is when we can give them little doses of appropriate sensory input and sensory activity throughout the day. And then the third thing we can do to help our children cope is to deal with behaviors as they arise in really sensory sensitive ways. And so here's where our three sensory hacks come in. We're going to first talk about some transition tricks. Transitions can be incredibly hard for kids with sensory challenges and sensory integration problems. Often transitions are times where there are a lot of noise, a lot of movement. There's a lot going on. The parent is less attentive. I'm certainly less attentive to my child's needs when I'm trying to get all four of them into the house after track club and get dinner ready. And so transitions can be some of our most challenging times as sensory parents. And so we're going to look at just a couple of tricks that we can use. And our first trick is to upgrade our daily routines with some new sensory components. So we all have routines that we go through with our children, and routines and rituals, the way that we do things over and over in repetitive ways, are so helpful to our children because they make them feel safe. So if we can add some new sensory components to an already established routine, it's really going to make these transitions easier for your child. So some of the things that I think about when I think about adding something new to an already established routine is waking up in the morning. So all kids have to wake up and go to school or work or wherever they're going. And a way that we can add some sensory input to that is by giving a hand or foot massage in the morning. So I have a super grumpy kid, and the way that I wake that fellow up in the morning is with a little foot massage. So I'll just rub his feet and say good morning in a quiet voice instead of just bursting in and saying, come on, it's time to get up. Just adding that sensory component to something that we're already doing. And then if you want to even double down on that, you could do your foot massage or hand massage with some scented lotion, right? So you add that olfactory sense to it, that the sense of smell to that nice tactile and proprioceptive massage. You can also add visual schedules to your life. When my children were younger, I had lots and lots of visual schedules. This just helped keep the whole house running more smoothly because the children could refer back to that all the time. They would say, what's next? And we'd just look at our schedule. Oh, here's a picture of your case manager. Your case manager's coming to the house now, right? So I would just create this with poster board and photographs of what's coming next. I often would put Velcro on the back so I could just reuse the photos over and over again. So having a visual schedule, having a visual chore chart. If you have your children do chores, you could write the names of the chores or put pictures of the chores on an index card, and then place those somewhere in your home that the child can see them. And so it gives that visual stimulus that helps them to move on to doing the chore, which is a hard transition for most of us. You can also add things to homework time. Homework time was always really challenging in our house, so we added lots and lots of fidgets, things that kids could play with their hands, little light up balls, anything that they could kind of hold and play with and move around with while they were doing their homework. We often did homework outdoors on the swing. So as a transition, I would say we're going to do homework, but first we're going to swing. And so we'd walk outside to the swings or go to the park with the swings. And then a few minutes in, I might hand the child their homework on a clipboard. So they get that sensory input, and it's also part of the daily routine. So that just helps so much with moving from one activity to another. Other ways that we can help our kids with transition is just utilizing sensory cues during transition. This can be a music cue, which is my favorite. It can be a rhythmic cue, so maybe a way that you clap your hands or a way that you chant time to go to school in this very rhythmic way. Rhythm is very regulating to the brain. So anytime we can use music and rhythm to help our children stay calm, it's fabulous. In our home for about a year and a half, we played a very specific song when it was time to leave the house and go to the next activity. And so I would just ask Alexa to play the song for us. Um, and the kids would know immediately, all right, this means I have about 3 minutes. I need to get my shoes on and get out. So using a sensory cue like music is great. My husband uses lighting cues. He's so good at it. In the evening, he begins turning down our lights right after dinner until when the lights are all the way down, the children know, okay, now it's time to head on to bed. And of course, they'll also get a verbal cue, and they may even get carried to bed depending on the evening. But knowing that there is that visual cue, that there's a lighting cue, can actually help the child to move from that one activity to the next in a smoother way than only giving the verbal prompt. And our last transition trick is to add somatosensory activity to any chaotic time in the day. Somatosensory simply means adding sensory and the body together, right? So using our body. And when we used somatosensory input with our children, the lower part of the brain, that really reactive, impulsive, aggressive part of the brain is calmed. So some very specific somatosensory activities I've used with my own children are things like doing a wall push-up or pushing against the wall. So we went to a church that had a downstairs area and an upstairs area. And the children began the church service downstairs, and then in a loud, huge group, everybody went upstairs, and this was really dysregulating to my children. And so before we would head upstairs, my kids would just press up against the wall for a couple of minutes. And I would talk to them while they're doing it. I'd be really encouraging, like, you can push harder, you've got this, right? And so they're getting that deep pressure, that joint compression by pushing against the wall. For my shortest kiddos, I would actually push down on their shoulders and tell them to raise their toes up, like go up on their toes. So they're pushing against me and I'm gently pushing against them. And just that kind of compression and that squeezing feeling, that tight feeling was incredibly calming to them. We'd also do crossing the midline activities. So even right before we get out of the car and go into an appointment, I might ask my son, take your left hand and put it on your right knee. Take your right hand and put it on your left knee. And we maybe do this 3 or 4 times, just adding this quick somatosensory activity to calm the lower brain, to get the child feeling more in control. Doing some deep breathing can do the same thing. So before transitions, I always try to add some kind of body or sensory activity into my kid's life, even if it's just something tiny like crossing the midline in the car. It can really help with that lower brain regulation. So our next hack is making the sensory bug out bag. Yours probably will not look like this. When I found this image, this is a military backpack. And a bug out bag is actually, the first time I heard that terminology was when I met some people who were survivalists, and they were talking to me about their bug out bags, and I had to go home quickly and Wikipedia that. What I discovered is your bug out bag is a bag that you have packed that has everything that you need to survive for 72 hours. Now, I certainly would not be carrying this bag with me everywhere I go, but when my children's sensory challenges were at an all-time high, I definitely had a sensory bug out bag. It looked more like my purse or a cute tote than this military bag, but it served the same purpose, which was surviving the evening. So when you create your own sensory bug out bag, this is your bag that you're just going to take with you when you go out places that you know are triggering for your children. For me and our family, I remember it was restaurants. Restaurants pushed my kids' buttons like no other. And so I always took our sensory bag with us to a restaurant. And what I have created here is just some ways for you to think about how you'll create your own bag. You're not going to make the same bag that I would have. Your bag will be different, and it will be different because your child is different from mine. But you want to create it in the same way, right? So first you want to have something visual in your bag. So if your child is triggered by bright lights and a lot of movement, then get them some shades that they can wear. This is my kiddo in the bottom picture with, I think he wore these sunglasses all summer a couple years ago. And so something that will block out the light and the intensity, and something that can help sort of dampen the child's visual field can be really helpful if they're highly stimulated by movement or light. Also in the top picture, you see my son using this really fun water timer. It's like a little mini lava lamp. And there's all kinds of these that you can purchase all over the place. And you can get these on Amazon. There's a ton of them in all different colors and shapes. And when I send out my follow-up email, I'm going to include a link to all the sensory products that I've talked about tonight, so that you can see those on Amazon. And if there's something that's right for your child, then you'll know exactly where to get that. So in your sensory bug out bag, you're going to want something visual, something that your child can see, something that's calm, or maybe something that actually blocks out movement and light. We want to address the sense of smell in our sensory bag as well. There are all kinds of products that have good smells. Lots and lots of sensory moms and dads use essential oils with their children. There are lots of jewelry that you can use to put essential oil in. One of my children, who is very, very much into olfactory activities, loved these tiny little hand sanitizers of all different scent. They're very socially acceptable to use in public. And so even though this child was older, no one really thought it was weird that he was using hand sanitizer. And he wasn't using it to clean his hands, but it was a great side effect. He was really using it for the smell, and he preferred sweet smells. And so something like this exact sanitizer would be great for his sensory bag. There's also a lot of products out there that are stuffed animals or other plushies that have scent. I love this one. It's for Halloween. This is from Scentco, and it's a pumpkin scented plush. And this can go right on the backpack or right on the handle of your bag. So you can have some kind of olfactory activity for your child in your sensory bag. For auditory stimulation or blocking out that stimulation, every sensory parent needs some headphones. At the top, this picture is my son wearing actual hunting gear headphones, and these we just purchased at a sporting goods store, and they're great for blocking out sound. This is what made many, many years of church doable for this guy. So instead of feeling like needles in his ears, he was able to put on his headphones. He could still hear enough, but it wasn't overwhelming, right? It dampened a lot of the sound that was really, really challenging for him. In the lower picture, these are just regular music headphones. So having children wear earbuds or over-the-ear headphones can also dampen sound. Again, very socially acceptable in most places to have headphones or earbuds with you or on you. But you can also play music for children who get a lot of calming out of that. So all of my kiddos listen to audiobooks or music as a way to stay calm and regulated in very loud places. So having sound dampening headphones or just earphones or earbuds where the child can listen to music is a must-have in your sensory bag. We also want to have some tactile objects, something that your child can touch. These tangles that you see in the top photograph are great. We love these in our family. They have all different textures, colors, but even just a ball with different textures or nubs on them can work great. You see my son in the lower picture there doing his homework while he's squeezing the ball and pressing it against his cheek. So I see all kinds of sensory input there, right? He's squeezing the ball. There's that proprioceptive. He's rubbing it on his cheek and ear. So that's that tactile. And he's doing homework. So he's self-regulating while he's doing another task. And again, this is perfect for restaurants. You could bring any of these items out to help your child regulate and feel calm, and it wouldn't cause a scene or cause a problem. We also need to meet our child's oral or taste needs. So many of our children come home from school with a chewed up t-shirt or chewed up sleeve, and we know they have that need to chew or to get oral input, so we can give them something more appropriate and have that in our sensory bag. You see this, this is another one of my children chewing on a rubber bracelet that is created to be chewed on. You can use food grade tubing from a hardware store to make little objects for kids to chew on. You can also just have crunchy snacks with you in your bag. Gum is fabulous as a way to calm a child down. It engages so many senses. It engages that proprioceptive, that sense of pressure in the jaw. It has a great smell. It has a great scent. And the cheaper that the gum is, the sort of harder it is to chew, which is great for that proprioception. But you can also just use sugarless gum as well. I always carry lots of gum, not only in my sensory bag, but just in my pocket or in my purse as well. And beef jerky is another great oral tool for kids because it tastes good. It's very salty, and so it's an intense flavor, but it also is hard to chew. So it gives them that proprioceptive input. And beef jerky is a great snack for kids on the way to an appointment or after an appointment when you know they're getting a little ramped up, because it's pretty clean for in the car. That's one I choose a lot for in the car. So we also need some things for our children's vestibular systems in our sensory bug out bag. This is a Dynadisc. It's a little rubber disc. The side that's pointing up is kind of nubby. If we could take this off the screen and turn it over, the other side is smooth. And this disc is inflatable, so it sort of feels like a yoga ball, and there's a lot of give to it. So we took these with us to restaurants for years and years, and our kids sat on them. It gave them enough room to wiggle and move because of the texture of the Dynadisc and the ability to move around on it, sort of like you would on a yoga ball, but it also keeps them in one spot. So they're not just dancing all over the booth, right? They're in a very specific place and they have that ability to move and rock. So I love the Dynadisc. These, again, you can purchase online or at a sporting goods store, but lots of people have a lot of good intentions to exercise, and that's what these are made for. So I also see them quite frequently in thrift stores, and I'm sure I've purchased at least 5 from thrift stores. So take a look in your thrift store if you can't find a Dynadisc or you want to get one on the cheap. So this is an awesome piece for your sensory bug out bag. And then the last items that, that we can add to our bag are for our children's proprioception. So this is something weighted. This again gives them that deep pressure, that sense of pressure. And in the photo with the little guy reading, what he has on his lap is actually a heating pad that I purchased at just a local store, like a Ross or Marshall's type store. And so it's a heating pad with beans or rice inside of it, so it has that weighted component, but it also has sequins on it. So these are those sequins that if you rub them one way, they're gold, and the other way, they're white. So this particular object not only gives us that proprioceptive input of the weighted object, but also that tactile and visual input. You can absolutely buy weighted lap pads and weighted blankets from a variety of places, but again, I really like having that ability to just use everyday objects so that I have more tools in my toolbox. So heat and cold pads make really, really wonderful weighted lap pads. There's also some weighted objects that I made with and for some children in our programs at Harmony. And these are made from socks. You see the top is a tube sock that we filled with beans and then simply sewed the end together, and that becomes a weighted shoulder scarf. And so it just lays around the neck and is heavy. And then we see our little weighted monster, and that's made from a chamois that you use to clean cars with. So again, we filled him with beans and rice and some essential oil, and then we sewed the bottom of the chamois glove closed, and that's a little weighted lap pad or just a weighted object that can lay on a child's back or sit on their thighs, or that you could use in a game. So again, we can use weighted objects for that proprioceptive input and not have to spend a fortune on them. So we talked about some awesome transition tips, some things that we can put in our sensory bug out bag for when we have to go to a restaurant or a play or church or some other event where we know our kids will be triggered with their sensory issues. Our final hack is creating our own sensory shelf in our home so that our children can have a sensory diet. And when we use the term sensory diet, it doesn't mean the food that they eat. What it means is the input that a child gets on a regular basis throughout the day. So a sensory diet is creating a schedule of sensory input for your child based on their needs. And so if you're going to do a sensory diet in your home with your kid, then you'll need some supplies to do that. And so this is actually a shelf from my own home. This is a sensory shelf that we have in our living room. These objects are available for children to use at any point during the day. And often I'll just say, you need to choose something from the sensory shelf, not as a punishment or discipline or to get the child back in line, but really as that sort of input to keep the child feeling regulated throughout the day. So on the first shelf, you see two plastic shoe boxes. The bottom one has sand in it. This is kinetic sand. The top one has rice in it. The other two smaller boxes are also just sensory bins, one with black sand and a little sifter, the other with rice. On the bottom shelf, we see the weighted lap pad. Inside that pink bucket is some Play-Doh and cookie cutters. We see several water timers. There's the one with black on the top and bottom, and behind it there's a blue one. And then a little box filled with all kinds of fidgets. You see a stretchy little pink monster, that tangle, and then some glow sticks. So this is just out in our home at all times. And what it does is it facilitates my children having sensory experiences on a regular basis during the day. So for you to create your own sensory shelf or sensory area in your home, here's a list of $25 essentials. So what you will need to do is get these at a Dollar Tree or Dollar General type store, 3 plastic shoe boxes with lids. And those are to create your sensory bins. They can also act as water bins. I typically don't leave those out. I usually will make a water bin if there's a child that is interested in playing with water that day, just because I don't want to leave it out and have my animals trying to get into the water bin. You can use a bag of rice or beans as filler so that children can use those inside the bins. Several packages of gems. Dollar Trees and Dollar Generals have all of those little glass gems, little plastic diamonds. Those are fabulous for burying down in the sand or clay and having the child pull those out. Glow sticks, and I'm going to show you what I use glow sticks for. They can just be a great visual activity for children, though. There is this component of moving the body to shake the glow stick and then having that visual stimulus. Squishy balls are like that little squishy animal, some type of fidget. Conditioner, 1 bottle of conditioner and 1 package of cornstarch. Those 2 ingredients can make a really, really nice putty that you can use for a nice long time. And you will find the recipe for that putty in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar app. And so you will just look for silken dough recipe, and it's right there. Water beads are these kind of squishy little beads. They also sometimes go under the name of Orbeez. Those are great for sensory bins and can often be found at dollar type stores. I already showed you how to create the weighted scarf with the sock. So you can buy the sock for your sensory starter kit, some Play-Doh, kinetic sand. I love to add little tools like the baster or funnel to my sensory bins, and then more trays and bowls so that you can create some fun sensory bins for your children. So for $25, that is a really wonderful place to start. With just these tools, you can create a great sensory corner for your children. And here are my own kids playing with sensory activities. So you see there at the left, that's my daughter playing in a sensory bin of spaghetti noodles, and that really is cooked spaghetti. In order to make it colorful, you can use food coloring, about 3 drops, with about 3 drops of rubbing alcohol in a plastic bag. That way the food coloring won't come off on their hands, but it just adds that beauty to it and just a nice visual stimulus. So there she is playing with sort of slimy noodles. This is a weird texture for her, and you see she started by using the spoon, but eventually she touched the cold and slimy noodles. There's my son playing with the baster and a bucket of water, all of which the baster and the bucket were on the sensory shelf, and he just asked to have water added to that. Colored rice, and he is digging for treasures in there. That's one of the gems that we bought. You see a photo of the water beads there at the bottom. And again, to make your rice beautiful and visual, you can just add a few drops of food coloring and a few drops of rubbing alcohol inside a plastic bag and rub it all together, and then just let it air out for a few minutes while it dries. And it just adds that beauty and also the visual appeal. Other things you can add to your basic sensory corner are things like temperature play. So this is my son when he was really little playing with ice, and there's a little food coloring down at the bottom there just to make it more appealing. But again, this is temperature play. And for a child that has challenges with things like interoception, sitting with him while he's playing with this, I was able to help him gain more insight into how does that feel on your hands? Oh, it's cold. How long have you had your hands in there? Right? And talking to him about this helps him to gain that body awareness. So even though he is playing, together you are working on sensory awareness. At the bottom on the left, a great use for these glow sticks, a glow stick bath. So you just put the glow sticks in the tub and dim the lights a bit. And I think this got my children clean for about 4 years when there was nothing else that would get them into the tub. The promise of a glow stick bath would often do that. If you add bubbles, it's even more super sensory. Again, just beans, any kind of digging gives kids that tactile, but also proprioceptive and visual stimulus and input. So adding objects to the bins that they can find are great. And then we don't want to forget those proprioceptive and vestibular forms of input as well. So although most folks don't have a playground at their home, going to the park to swing and work on homework, or doing activities outdoors where you are inverted, where your head is down and your feet are up, are really great vestibular input. If you have space for a yoga ball, there are so many activities and great somatosensory input that you can get from a yoga ball. So again, what we want to think about is how can we create a space in our home that facilitates a good, rich sensory diet where my child is getting a lot of sensory needs met. Sensory play is not only good for children who have sensory challenges, it's really good for children in general. Sensory play is so developmentally beneficial for children. It gives us that targeted sensory input, and I'm a student of Dr. Bruce Perry, and Dr. Perry uses this word dosing that I just love, and I think about anytime I'm working with my own kids, that we're giving them a little dose of targeted sensory input. Each time I put a new sensory bin out, each time they play with that, it's this little dose of targeted input. And that's what sensory play does for our children. Sensory play really develops those fine motor skills. Think about hiding a little gem or a plastic animal deep in the slime or deep in the clay, and those really intense fine motor skills that it takes to feel that and find it and then pull it out. So we can be developing fine motor skills. This is great for language development, especially if you're playing with your child. And I really encourage you to engage in sensory play beside and with your child. You don't necessarily have to be doing exactly the same thing. You could be side by side playing with your sensory bins, but that language development is really engaged when we're talking to our kids about textures and how it feels and how it smells and the shape of this. Sensory play strengthens cause and effect thinking. And for many of our children, especially those who come from a place of abuse and neglect, cause and effect thinking is quite weak. And so we can do things like add our funnel, right? So we put a small jar in the rice bin and say, how do you get the rice in there? And the child will probably try for a little bit to get the rice down the small neck of the jar. And then we can introduce the funnel. Just playing with a funnel strengthens that cause and effect thinking. Play like this increases attention span. It introduces and it strengthens the child's own body awareness, right? And we know body awareness is essential for self-regulation. We could talk for a whole hour just about the body and self-regulation. Sensory play increases creativity. It supports our kids in problem solving. And that final one, I just want to reiterate again, dyadic play or play with two, right? With mother and child or father and child builds attachment. And what we know is that attachment and self-regulation go hand in hand. And so our children will have better skills, more self-regulation, and also be getting that targeted sensory input if we allow them to engage in sensory play. So I really hope that these 3 hacks have been helpful for you. Thinking about transitions as a time to do sensory activity, building your sensory bug out bag, and creating a great place in your home to encourage sensory play. I hope that you enjoy your sensational sensory kid the rest of this week and on into the rest of their lives. And I appreciate you being with me. If you would like to be in contact with me, you can send me an email at allison@harmonyfamilycenter.org. Thanks so much for joining us and have a wonderful evening.